I remember the way my mother's voice carried across the lawn that afternoon. Calm, sharp, perfectly rehearsed. "You're not in this one, darling," she said, waving her hand lightly, as though exclusion was an act of etiquette, not cruelty. I stood at the edge of the grass, watching as my family arranged themselves beneath the oak tree, the same one that had framed our annual photo for as long as I could remember. My father adjusted his tie. My brother straightened his jacket. My mother tilted her chin just slightly toward the light. The photographer, someone they'd hired from the city, lifted his camera and said, "Beautiful. Hold that." I didn't move. I didn't need to. I'd already been erased long before the shutter clicked. When the flash went off, I caught the reflection in the window behind them. My mother's smile, my father's arm around my brother's shoulder, and me, a blurred shadow on the edge of the frame. A ghost, perfectly placed by accident. If you've ever been edited out of your own family, tell me where you're listening from, because the silence afterward always sounds the same. It hums, polite and permanent. "Don't take it personally," my mother said later, as if the sentence could iron out the creases in her tone. "It's just symmetry. You'd throw off the balance." Symmetry. That was her word for everything. The house was symmetrical. The stories were symmetrical. Even love somehow was distributed according to her sense of geometry. My brother Daniel fit perfectly on one side of that line. I never did. The afternoon stretched into evening, the golden light cooling into blue. I stayed behind as they moved inside for dinner. From the garden, I could hear the clinking of plates, the soft rise and fall of conversation, the kind of practiced warmth that only exists when an outsider might be watching. When I finally stepped back inside, no one noticed. My seat at the table was already taken. My aunt had filled it without realizing. I didn't correct her. I just stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. The candles flickered, the wine glasses sparkled, and for the first time I didn't feel anger. Just distance. Dinner passed in a blur of laughter that I wasn't part of. My mother's hand rested gently on Daniel's arm as she spoke to him about his new promotion. "You've made us proud," she said, the words smooth and deliberate. Her eyes never met mine. When the plates were cleared, I walked down the hallway, past the framed photographs that lined the walls, each one a curated memory, each one missing the same thing: me. There were birthday parties I'd been at, but never seen in print. Vacations I remembered vividly, but where my place had been cropped out like a mistake. I stopped in front of the last frame, the most recent one. My parents, Daniel, his wife, their children. The symmetry was perfect. I stared at it for a long moment before noticing something faint in the corner, a small reflection in the glass, a blur of light, like the echo of a camera flash. I reached up and straightened the frame. The nail holding it tilted slightly, revealing a thin crack in the wall behind it. Out of habit more than curiosity, I pressed lightly on it. The plaster shifted, soft from years of humidity. A faint draft slipped through. Behind it, something clicked. Hollow. Later, when the house was quiet and the conversation had faded into sleep, I returned with a small knife from the kitchen and pried the panel open. Dust spilled out in a thin stream. Inside, wrapped in old fabric, were a few small objects: a photograph, a stack of film reels, and a projector so old it still smelled faintly of oil and heat. The photograph was the first thing I looked at. My parents, young and smiling, Daniel, a toddler in their arms, and beside them, a baby, me. My mother's hand rested lightly on my shoulder, but her eyes weren't on me. They were on the camera, perfect and deliberate. The back of the photo was dated, but the year was scratched out. I held it under the lamplight, tracing the faint outlines of the missing number. The film reels were labeled with the same handwriting: familiar, looping, too neat to be anything but hers. One reel had a title smudged almost beyond recognition: Christmas, 1989. I turned the projector over in my hands. The weight of it felt like memory, old, mechanical, patient. Somewhere upstairs, my mother's voice drifted faintly through the air, humming the same tune she always did before bed. The melody was soft, practiced, unaware that I was standing below her, holding the one thing she'd spent decades trying to bury. I didn't sleep that night. The reels sat on the table, their metal edges catching the glow of the lamp. Every so often, I'd catch my reflection in them, a distorted circle of light and shadow. By dawn, I knew exactly what I was going to do. They had taken me out of every photo that mattered, but tomorrow I would show them the ones they couldn't erase. The morning light felt colder than usual, even though it streamed through the same lace curtains that had hung in the living room for decades. Dust shimmered in it, tiny flecks suspended in silence, the kind that only houses with too much history seem to know. The projector sat on the table where I had left it, its metal body reflecting slivers of gold from the sun. The reels beside it looked harmless now, innocent even, but I knew better. Things that are hidden this carefully never tell gentle stories. I closed the curtains before turning the machine on. The faint hum of the motor filled the room, low and mechanical, like an old heartbeat restarting after years of sleep. The reel spun, the film threading through my fingers, cool and fragile. I adjusted the focus, and the first image flickered onto the wall. Christmas, exactly as the label said. There we were, my parents, smiling in that effortless way they did when someone was watching. Daniel, chubby-faced, tearing open wrapping paper. My mother laughing beside him. Perfect posture, perfect light. And then, just out of frame, my small hand reached toward the camera, blurry and incomplete. I recognized the dress. It was red with white stitching, my favorite then, though I hadn't seen it in years. The next reel started automatically. The laughter faded, replaced by quieter moments. The kitchen, candlelight, the sound of my mother humming softly. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. In the frame behind her, a man, my father, entered the room carrying 2 glasses of wine. He kissed her cheek, and for a second she flinched. Just slightly, enough for the lens to catch it. The camera turned abruptly, as if whoever had been filming didn't mean to capture that. The focus shifted to the window, the Christmas tree reflected faintly in the glass. In that reflection, for only a heartbeat, I saw it. My mother's hand gripping the edge of the table, her ring slipping halfway off her finger. It wasn't the motion of a woman happy to be filmed. It was someone holding on. I paused the reel. The light buzzed, flickering softly. My own reflection hovered faintly over the image, overlapping hers. I felt that same cold, hollow space inside my chest, the one that had opened yesterday when she'd told me to step aside for the photo. There was something else on the table, a small envelope tucked beneath the last reel. It hadn't been there before. Maybe it had fallen when I'd opened the wall. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. The ink was faded, but the letters were unmistakably hers. Controlled, practiced, like she was afraid of what her own words might reveal. Inside, a single photograph. It wasn't like the others. This one was unpolished, taken in haste. My mother was holding me, much younger, maybe 2 or 3 years old. Her expression was unreadable, not staged, not smiling. In the corner of the picture, barely visible, was a man's hand, one I didn't recognize. It wasn't my father's. I turned the photo over. No date this time. Just 2 words in faint ink. Keep this safe. The film reels beside me spun slightly as the motor wound down, and I realized the projector light was still running, showing an empty frame on the wall. The flicker filled the room, making the air look alive, almost breathing. I sat there for a long time, the photo resting in my palm, my mind slowly piecing together what she must have buried. Why she'd hidden this. Why my presence had always made her uneasy. It wasn't just neglect. It was guilt. That night, when everyone gathered again for dinner, the weight of what I'd discovered pressed against me like a secret begging for air. My mother's laughter floated down the hallway before I entered the dining room. The table was bright, full of food, full of noise. No one noticed me slip into a seat at the far end. Daniel was talking about his upcoming trip to Spain. My father nodded proudly, his glass raised slightly. My mother's eyes shone, the same performative warmth I'd seen 100 times before. I looked at her face, really looked, and for the first time I saw the cracks. Her smile tightened whenever I moved. Her voice wavered when she said my name, like it didn't belong in her mouth. She'd spent years building her version of perfection, framing herself inside every photograph as the centerpiece of a story that wasn't real. And now I had proof she'd hidden something long before I ever understood what distance meant. As the plates were cleared, she turned to me suddenly. "You're awfully quiet," she said, tone clipped, polite. I met her eyes. Just tired, I said. I didn't sleep much. Why not? I paused. I found something last night. In the wall. The silence that followed was sharp enough to break glass. Daniel laughed awkwardly, assuming it was a joke. My father looked up from his plate, brow furrowing slightly. My mother didn't move. Only her hand, resting on the tablecloth, trembled faintly. What do you mean in the wall? She asked finally. An old projector, I said. Some film reels? A photograph. Her face drained of color, though she tried to hide it behind a sip of wine. That must have been your father's, she said quickly. He keeps all sorts of old nonsense. But her tone betrayed her. I knew then that the reels weren't his. They were hers. I smiled, small and quiet. Maybe, I said, but the handwriting on them looked a lot like yours. She set her glass down a little too hard. The sound echoed across the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then she stood abruptly. Excuse me, she said, her voice clipped. I need to check the roast. She left the room without looking back. I didn't follow. I just sat there, tracing the edge of the photograph in my pocket, feeling the truth settling like dust after a long storm. Tomorrow, I thought, would be the family photo again, and for the first time, I'd have something to add to their perfect symmetry. Something real. The next morning began with the usual choreography. My mother's voice echoing from the kitchen, Daniel's laughter traveling down the hallway, my father's measured silence in between. The air smelled of cinnamon and expectation, but beneath it was something brittle, something that cracked when no one was listening. I stayed in my room longer than usual, the photo still on my nightstand. The words, "Keep this safe," had etched themselves into my mind overnight. I'd read them a dozen times, tracing the faded ink until it became almost a whisper. My mother's handwriting had always been elegant, controlled, but these letters wavered slightly, as if her hand had trembled when she wrote them. Downstairs, the table was already set for brunch. Silver cutlery, white linen, the good plates that only appeared on holidays or for guests who mattered. My reflection appeared faintly in the glass cabinet as I passed, layered over the neat rows of china, a ghost observing its own family. Morning, Daniel said, glancing up from his phone. You look like you didn't sleep. I didn't, I said evenly. My mother didn't look up. Maybe if you didn't stay up all night reading, you'd look less pale. I smiled faintly. I wasn't reading. That made her pause for a fraction of a second, so small that no one else noticed. But I did. She recovered quickly, asking Daniel about his travel plans, her tone sweet and effortless. The kind of tone she used when she needed control. As they talked, I let my gaze wander to the old wooden cabinet across the room. It held decades of family memories, albums, trophies, framed photographs. All of them carefully curated, all of them telling the same story. Only this time I knew what was missing. When brunch ended, Daniel went to make a call, and my father disappeared into his study. My mother began clearing the table, humming under her breath. I helped her in silence, watching how her movements grew sharper the longer I stayed in the room. Finally, she said without looking up, "You shouldn't go rummaging through old things. There's a reason they're put away." I didn't know it was a secret, I said, my voice soft but steady. Her hand froze on the edge of a plate. Some things belong to the past. Digging them up won't change anything. Then why hide them at all? She looked at me then, really looked. Her eyes were the same color as mine, though hers had grown harder with age. Because not every truth deserves light, she said. I let the silence stretch between us, thin and trembling. You mean not every lie survives it? I replied quietly. She turned away, her jaw tightening. You've always had a talent for dramatics. And you've always had a talent for symmetry, I said. But life isn't a photograph, Mother. It doesn't stay perfect just because you crop out the parts you don't like. Her hands trembled as she set the last plate down. I don't know what you think you found, but I suggest you let it go. It's not worth ruining what's left of this family. The sentence hung there, fragile and false. I almost laughed at the irony of it. What's left? There hadn't been a family to ruin for years. Just a performance. That evening, the house filled again. Cousins, aunts, family friends, the usual chorus of familiar faces pretending everything was fine. The reunion dinner was the highlight of every gathering, complete with speeches, laughter, and of course the annual slideshow. Photos from previous years, projected neatly onto the white wall in the living room. The tradition my mother adored most. By the time the guests arrived, the scent of roast chicken and wine filled the air. My mother was radiant in her deep blue dress, her smile perfect, uncracked. Daniel was his usual charming self, drawing attention like he was born for the camera. And me, I stayed in the background, blending into the corners like part of the furniture. When the laughter reached its peak, my mother clapped her hands gently. "Everyone," she said, her voice smooth, commanding. "Let's gather for the slideshow before dessert." The lights dimmed. The projector hummed to life. The first images appeared, familiar ones. Family vacations, birthdays, laughter frozen in frames. The crowd cooed and chuckled, each photo another piece of the illusion. Then came the one from yesterday, freshly taken. My mother, father, Daniel, his wife, their children. Perfect symmetry. No me. A soft murmur rippled through the room, though no one said anything. They didn't have to. The absence was obvious. I saw a few eyes glance toward me, then away again, embarrassed for reasons they didn't fully understand. I waited until the last image faded. Then, before my mother could speak, I stepped forward. "Before we finish," I said calmly, "I'd like to show something I found. Something old." My mother's expression didn't break, but her hand tightened around her wine glass. "Now's not the time," she said, a warning masked as politeness. "It's family history," I said. "Seems fitting." I reached for the remote on the table beside her, switching the input. The projector light flickered, then steadied. The room fell silent as the old reel came to life, the same one I had watched that morning. The image appeared, grainy but clear enough. My parents, young. Daniel, a toddler. Me, just a baby. Laughter filled the air, real and unedited. But then the second reel began, the kitchen scene. The reflection, the flinch. My mother's face in half shadow, caught between smiles and truth. The murmurs grew louder. Someone gasped softly. My father leaned forward, confusion etching deep lines into his forehead. Daniel looked from me to her, realization beginning to form. My mother stood abruptly, the wine glass slipping slightly in her hand. "Turn it off," she said, voice trembling. I didn't. The film continued. The reflection, the man's hand, the moment her mask fell for just one frame. The truth wasn't explosive. It was quiet, undeniable, framed in the stillness between one blink and the next. When the reel ended, the screen went white. No one spoke. The hum of the projector filled the space between us. Then, softly, I said, "You always told me the camera doesn't lie." Her lips parted, but no words came. The glass in her hand cracked under pressure, a small sound that echoed louder than any answer she could give. I turned off the projector. The room stayed silent. The truth didn't need applause. For a long moment, no one moved. The white glow from the projector still painted the wall, turning faces pale, almost translucent. My mother stood frozen at the center of it, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and rage, the shattered glass trembling faintly in her hand. Daniel looked at her, then at me, as if trying to decide which of us was real. My father's silence was the heaviest thing in the room, thicker than the air itself. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice low and trembling. "You had no right," I didn't answer. The hum of the projector filled the space between us, steady and mechanical, like the ticking of an unseen clock. "This was private," she said again, louder this time, the edge of command creeping back into her tone. "It was family. Exactly," I said softly. "Family." The word seemed to hang there, stripped of meaning. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their unease thickening as the seconds passed. My aunt looked down at her lap. One of the children whispered something and was quickly hushed. My father rose slowly from his chair. "What was that exactly?" he asked, his voice deep but calm, the way it always was before he made a decision he couldn't undo. My mother didn't answer. Her knuckles were white around the broken stem of her glass. "It was nothing," she said finally. "Old film, misunderstood. Then why hide it?" I asked. She turned toward me then, her eyes sharp as glass. "Because some things don't belong in the open. Because people can't understand. Or because they might," I said. Her lips parted, but no sound followed. The silence was its own confession. Daniel stood now, too. What is she talking about? He demanded, his voice breaking slightly. Mom? She didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed on me, a silent plea buried beneath the anger. I could see it. The fear, the exhaustion of years spent maintaining the illusion of a perfect frame. She wanted to stop it here, to fold the truth back into the dark where it belonged. But it was too late. I walked to the projector and ejected the reel. The film was warm between my fingers, faintly trembling as the machine cooled. You always said the camera didn't lie, I said. But it didn't tell the whole story either, did it? My father took a step closer. What story? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. It was before you were born, she said, though the words were meant for him, not me. Before any of this, I stayed still. The guests were silent now, suspended in that fragile moment between revelation and recognition. The air hummed with it. My mother's next words came slower, as if dragged from a place she'd sealed off decades ago. He was a photographer, she said. I met him before your father. We were close, and then I found out I was expecting. My father's face hardened, though he didn't speak. The truth was already rewriting everything in his mind. The edges of the family portrait began to blur. I thought I could make it disappear, she continued, her voice trembling now. Your father wanted a child so badly, and when you came... She looked at me then, eyes wet, fragile. I thought love would make it simple. But love doesn't erase what's hidden. It only delays the collapse. Daniel stared at her, pale. You mean, she nodded faintly, she's not your father's daughter. The words landed like stones in still water, quiet, but irreversible. The ripples reached everyone in the room. No one spoke, not even me. I'd suspected pieces of it, but hearing it aloud was different. It was like standing under a sky that had suddenly forgotten its stars. My father sat back down, his face unreadable. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. All these years, he said quietly, all these years you let me believe I did what I had to, she said, her tone snapping for a moment, then breaking again. You wouldn't have stayed. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second I saw both pity and distance in his eyes. Maybe not, he said, but it would have been honest. I could have spoken then, could have said something to fill the silence. But I didn't. I simply turned the projector back on. The final reel began to play, unlabeled, unmarked. At first, the footage was blank light, then shapes slowly emerged. A man's voice behind the camera, low and warm. My mother's laughter, softer than I'd ever heard it. Then her face appeared, years younger, eyes bright with something that wasn't fear. She looked happy, genuinely happy, and in her arms a baby, me. The room seemed to stop breathing. The man leaned into frame then, smiling at the camera before kissing my forehead. He said my name clear and certain. The image froze there, his face lit by the glow of the film. Gentle, unknown, but unmistakably real. When the reel ended, I turned off the projector. The light faded slowly, leaving only the pale imprint of that final frame lingering on the wall. No one said a word. My mother stood there, hollow-eyed, and my father looked away. Daniel sat down heavily, staring at the table like it could offer him answers. I set the reel down gently. Now the frame is complete, I said quietly. My mother's voice came out thin and broken. What do you want from me? Nothing, I said. You've already given me everything I needed. I left the room then, stepping into the cool night air. The door closed softly behind me, the faint hum of the projector still echoing in my ears. Inside, the truth would keep playing in their minds long after the film stopped, frame by frame, until the symmetry they loved finally dissolved into what it had always been. Real life. The night air felt weightless against my skin as I stepped outside. The laughter, the gasps, the sound of glass shattering. It all seemed to dissolve behind me. The world had narrowed to the rhythm of my own footsteps, and the faint hum of cicadas in the garden. The projector light still glowed faintly through the curtains, flickering like a heartbeat that refused to stop. I could almost hear them inside, voices low, strained, circling around a truth too large to hold. The sky above was vast and moonlit, stretching wide and indifferent. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. The air smelled faintly of rain and smoke from the old fireplace. It had been years since I'd felt that smell, home and distance blending into something I couldn't quite name. Behind the closed door, I imagined my mother sitting down again, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. My father would be quiet still, the weight of decades pressing against his chest. Daniel, torn between anger and confusion, would look for something to blame. The symmetry they had spent their lives perfecting was gone now, cracked through the center, the truth spilling out like light through broken glass. I didn't feel triumphant, just steady, calm in a way that made sense for the first time. Some justice doesn't roar, it exhales. I walked to the far end of the garden, where the grass grew longer and the oak tree stretched over the fence. This had always been my spot as a child, the one place where the noise couldn't reach me. I sat beneath it now, my back against the cool bark, and for the first time I felt the silence as something kind. Not loneliness, just space. The photo I'd found earlier was still in my pocket. I took it out and turned it over in the moonlight. My mother holding me, younger, freer, unaware of how the years would twist around her secret. I studied her face, the same face that had looked at me tonight with a mixture of love and fear. Maybe that was all she'd ever known how to give. Maybe that was enough. From inside the house came a faint sound, a chair scraping, a door closing, the soft clink of a glass being set down. Life, already moving forward in its quiet, broken rhythm. I thought about the man in the film, the stranger with my eyes and smile. The way he'd said my name, steady, sure, not as if it belonged to him, but as if he belonged to it. The echo of it stayed in my ears. I wondered if he was still alive somewhere, if he ever thought of the child in that flickering light, the one he never saw grow up. I didn't need to find him. Some absences don't need filling. They only need naming. I sat there until the first trace of dawn touched the horizon. The house behind me was dark now. The projector had gone silent, the truth finally resting where it belonged. When I stood, the grass brushed against my hands, leaving dew that clung to my skin. I turned once to look at the windows, each one a faint reflection of the night before, of everything that had been exposed and undone. The house looked smaller somehow, its perfection stripped down to something more human. I walked to the edge of the property and stopped at the old stone path that led to the gate. There, beside it, sat an old wooden crate of discarded frames, empty, unused, waiting to be filled. I picked one up. The glass inside was cracked down the middle, dividing it into two uneven halves. For a moment, I saw it as a metaphor, then realized it didn't need to be one. It was just what it was, flawed, but still whole enough to hold something. When I reached the front door again, I paused. Through the window, I could see the faint outline of my father sitting at the table. His hands were folded, his head bowed, not in defeat, but in thought. My mother stood near the sink, staring out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She looked smaller now, like someone finally standing in her own shadow. She saw me. For a long second, we just looked at each other. No words, no gestures, only acknowledgement. I nodded once, an unspoken truce. Not forgiveness, not yet, just understanding. Then I turned and walked out into the street. The morning was pale and quiet. The world outside felt untouched by what had happened, as if the truth we'd lived inside that house didn't matter beyond its walls. And maybe it didn't. Maybe justice didn't always echo. It simply balanced things out, unseen and complete. At the corner, I stopped and looked up. The sun was rising, slow and deliberate, washing the sky in pale gold. I thought of the reels, the light, the way the truth had glowed across that wall, harsh, beautiful, cleansing. I reached into my bag and pulled out the photograph one last time. For a moment, I held it against the light, watching how the edges caught the sun. Then carefully, I placed it into the cracked frame I'd taken from the crate. The two halves of glass held it perfectly, divided yet secure, like the truth itself. As I walked away, I felt the faintest warmth at my back, the kind that comes not from victory, but from release. I didn't look back again. Some stories don't end with a door closing. They end with light spilling through the cracks.